The host, known for her sharp tongue and critical opinions on political figures, had invited Melania Trump for an exclusive interview. The anticipation in the studio was electric, and everyone was waiting for the clash of opinions. The liberal host was known for her fiery interviews, often pushing her guests into uncomfortable situations. She had made a name for herself by grilling public figures, especially those associated with conservative politics. Melania Trump, however, was no stranger to pressure. As the former First Lady of the United States, she had endured criticism from all sides, and yet she had always carried herself with grace. That morning, she walked onto the set with calm confidence, her head held high and a soft smile on her face. She was dressed impeccably, as always, exuding an air of elegance and poise that had become her signature. The audience settled in, some of them excited to see a confrontation, others curious to see how Melania would respond to the tough questions ahead. The stage was set for what many expected to be a heated conversation, one that would leave people talking for days. As the cameras began to roll, the host wasted no time. She opened with a sharp question about Melania's time in the White House, focusing on the controversies and public scrutiny she had faced. It was clear from the start that the host wasn't interested in small talk or pleasantries. She was going for the jugular, trying to corner Melania with tough, pointed questions. But Melania remained calm. She listened carefully, her face expressionless, giving no indication that the host's words were getting to her. When it was her turn to speak, she chose her words carefully, answering with a quiet strength that instantly caught everyone's attention. "I know people have their opinions," Melania said softly, "but I focused on what was important. My role was to support my husband, care for my family, and help children around the world. I don't let the noise distract me from what matters." The audience was silent for a moment, taken aback by her measured response. But the host wasn't done yet. She quickly fired back, digging deeper into the controversies that surrounded Melania during her time in the White House. She questioned her involvement in political matters, her initiatives, and even her personal life. It was clear that the host was trying to provoke a reaction, to get Melania to slip up, to show some sign of frustration. But Melania remained unflappable. She answered each question with the same calm demeanor, refusing to be baited into a heated argument. Her responses were thoughtful, direct, and surprisingly disarming. Each time the host tried to push harder, Melania would respond with grace, never raising her voice, never showing any sign of irritation. The tension in the room was palpable. The audience, who had come expecting a fiery exchange, was now sitting on the edge of their seats, wondering how long Melania could keep her cool. Some were even starting to wonder if the host had met her match. As the interview progressed, it became clear that the host was growing frustrated. Melania's calm and collected responses weren't giving her the dramatic moment she had hoped for. The host decided to switch tactics. Instead of focusing on politics, she began to ask personal questions, digging into Melania's private life in a way that made the audience uncomfortable. "You've been criticized for being too quiet," the host said, her tone sharp. "People say you've stayed in the background while your husband made all the decisions. Why didn't you ever speak up? Why didn't you use your platform more?" It was a pointed question, one that many had asked before. But this time, the host's tone was accusatory, as if she were blaming Melania for not doing enough. For the first time during the interview, Melania's expression shifted slightly. There was a flicker of emotion in her eyes, but it wasn't anger. It was something deeper, something more personal. "When you are in the spotlight," Melania began, her voice steady, "people think they know everything about you. But they don't. They don't see the sacrifices, the personal struggles. They don't understand what it's like to protect your family, to shield your child from the harshness of the world. I made choices that I thought were best for my family, and I stand by those choices." The audience was silent again. This was not the response anyone had expected. Melania's words carried a weight that hung in the air, and for the first time, the host seemed to hesitate. She had been trying to push Melania into a corner, but instead, she had touched on something deeply personal. But the host wasn't done yet. She pressed on, asking about Melania's relationship with the press, about the criticism she had faced as First Lady, and about the public's perception of her. "You've been called a lot of things," the host said. "Cold, uninvolved, detached. How do you respond to those labels?" Melania took a deep breath, and for a moment, it seemed like she might finally lose her cool. But instead, she surprised everyone with her response. "I don't respond to labels," she said softly. "I know who I am. My family knows who I am. The people who love me know who I am. That is enough for me." The simplicity and honesty of her answer left the audience speechless. There was no dramatic comeback, no fiery retort, just a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. As the interview continued, it became clear that the host was losing control of the narrative. What was supposed to be a tough, confrontational interview was turning into something entirely different. Melania wasn't taking the bait, and the more the host tried to push, the more it became clear that Melania had the upper hand. The host, sensing that the interview wasn't going as planned, decided to take a more aggressive approach. She began to ask questions that were clearly designed to provoke a reaction, bringing up old controversies and criticisms that had long since faded from the public eye. But Melania remained calm. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't show any signs of frustration, and she didn't let the host's words get to her. Instead, she answered each question with the same quiet strength that had defined the entire interview. The audience, who had come expecting a fiery confrontation, was now watching in awe as Melania masterfully handled each question. There was a tension in the air, but it wasn't the kind of tension the host had intended. Instead, it was a tension born out of the unexpected turn the interview had taken. The host, realizing that she wasn't going to get the dramatic moment she had hoped for, decided to change tactics once again. The frustration on the host's face was becoming more apparent. She had expected a fight, a dramatic back and forth that would have made for great TV. Instead, she found herself being calmly and quietly outmaneuvered by Melania Trump, who had turned the interview into a showcase of her resilience and grace. Determined not to let the interview end without getting the reaction she wanted, the host made one final push. She brought up one of the most sensitive topics, Melania's marriage to Donald Trump. The host's question was loaded, designed to strike at the heart of what she thought was Melania's weakness. "Many people have questioned your marriage," the host began, her tone sharp and direct. "They've speculated about your silence during your husband's controversies. Some even say you're only with him for his money and power. What do you have to say to those who doubt the sincerity of your relationship?" The audience held their breath. This was the moment they had been waiting for, the moment the host had clearly been working toward all along. It was a deeply personal question, one that had been the subject of countless rumors and tabloid stories. The tension in the room was almost unbearable as everyone waited to see how Melania would respond. For a brief moment, Melania looked down, as if considering her answer carefully. When she looked up again, her eyes were filled with a quiet strength that no one had expected. She took a deep breath and, in her soft but steady voice, she responded. "People will always talk," Melania said, her tone even. "They will always make assumptions about things they don't understand. But my marriage is my private life. The love and respect I have for my husband, and the love we have for our family, is not something that needs to be explained or defended. I don't live my life based on what others think. I live it based on what I know in my heart to be true." The audience was stunned into silence. The simplicity of her words, the way she refused to be drawn into the host's trap, was more powerful than any heated argument could have been. Melania had turned what could have been a moment of vulnerability into a moment of quiet defiance. She had shown, once again, that she wasn't going to let anyone dictate how she lived her life. The host, realizing that her final push had failed, looked visibly flustered. She had thrown her best shot, and Melania had calmly deflected it. The audience, sensing that the host had lost control of the interview, began to murmur among themselves. The energy in the room had shifted completely, and it was clear that Melania had won over many of the people watching. But the interview wasn't over yet. With the tension in the room now at its peak, the host made one last attempt to regain control. She shifted the conversation away from personal matters and tried to steer it back to politics, asking about Melania's time as First Lady and her thoughts on current events. But by this point, it was clear that the audience was no longer interested in the host's aggressive questioning. They had seen something in Melania that they hadn't expected: strength, grace, and an unshakable sense of self. The host's attempts to provoke her now seemed petty in comparison to the dignity with which Melania had conducted herself. Sensing that she was losing the audience, the host decided to take a different approach. She softened her tone and tried to engage Melania in a more civil discussion about her Be Best initiative, a cause that Melania had championed during her time in the White House. But Melania, still composed and calm, didn't let the shift in tone distract her. She spoke passionately about the work she had done to help children and families, and the importance of focusing on kindness, respect, and the well-being of future generations. Her words were simple, but they were heartfelt, and they struck a chord with many of the viewers. It was at this moment that the tide fully turned. What had started as a tense, confrontational interview had now become something entirely different. The audience, many of whom had come expecting to see Melania on the defensive, were now listening to her with newfound respect. She had defied their expectations, and in doing so, had won them over. The host, realizing that the dynamic had shifted entirely, began to lose her edge. Her questions became softer, less pointed, and it was clear that she was no longer in control of the interview. Melania had taken the reins, not through force or aggression, but through quiet strength and unshakable poise. As the interview drew to a close, something unexpected happened. The audience, who had remained mostly silent throughout the tense exchange, began to applaud. It started as a slow, tentative clap, but it quickly grew into a full standing ovation. Melania, who had remained composed and calm throughout the entire interview, looked slightly taken aback by the response. She hadn't come to the show seeking validation or applause, but the audience's reaction was a clear sign that she had won them over. The host, visibly flustered by the audience's reaction, tried to wrap up the interview with a few closing remarks, but it was clear that the moment belonged to Melania. She had entered the interview as a guest, but she was leaving as the star. As the cameras cut to a commercial break, Melania stood up and offered the audience a small, gracious smile. She thanked the host for having her on the show and made her way off the set, leaving behind an audience that was still buzzing with excitement. It wasn't the fiery confrontation that the host had been hoping for, but it was something far more powerful. Melania had shown the world a side of herself that many hadn't seen before, a woman of quiet strength, unshakable grace, and a deep sense of self-assurance. In the days that followed the interview, the media was buzzing with reactions to what had happened on live television. Headlines across the country highlighted Melania's calm and composed demeanor during the interview, with many praising her for handling the host's tough questions with grace and poise. Social media was flooded with clips of the interview, and people from all walks of life were talking about how Melania had turned the tables on the host. What was supposed to be a tense, confrontational exchange had become a powerful moment of quiet defiance, and Melania had come out on top. Even those who had been critical of her in the past couldn't help but admire the way she had handled herself. She had faced intense scrutiny and personal attacks, yet she had remained calm, composed, and true to herself. It was a lesson in dignity and resilience that resonated with people around the world. The host, meanwhile, faced backlash for her aggressive approach. Many viewers felt that she had crossed a line with her personal questions and that she had underestimated Melania's ability to handle the pressure. The interview, which had been intended to put Melania on the defensive, had instead backfired, leaving the host looking petty and unprofessional. But for Melania, the interview was just another day in the public eye. She had faced challenges before, and she would face them again. But she had shown the world that she was more than capable of handling whatever came her way. And in the end, it was her quiet strength, her grace under pressure, and her unwavering sense of self that left everyone speechless. The days following Melania Trump's powerful appearance rippled through every corner of the media and everyday conversation. People couldn't stop talking about how she had remained unshaken despite the host's pointed attacks. What made the whole moment resonate so deeply was the simplicity of her words and the grace she displayed. In a world where so many public figures lashed out or got defensive, Melania's composure left a lasting mark on those who watched. One major news outlet ran an opinion piece titled, "Melania's quiet strength is the power we didn't see coming." The article highlighted the contrast between the host's aggressive style and Melania's calm demeanor, praising her for not giving in to provocation. The author argued that this kind of strength, one that doesn't need to shout to be heard, was a rare quality in today's world, and it was precisely why Melania's words left such a lasting impression. It wasn't just the media, though. Everyday people, from various backgrounds, were moved by what they had witnessed. Conversations in cafes, on social media, and even in classrooms reflected the impact of Melania's performance on live television. It became clear that she had struck a chord with those who were tired of the constant arguing and shouting in public discourse. Her refusal to engage in petty back and forth had set a new example for how to face criticism with dignity. In schools, teachers even started using the interview in their lessons about emotional intelligence and handling conflict. One particular clip, where Melania calmly deflected the host's personal questions, became a prime example of how to maintain control in a situation designed to make you feel small. Young students, who often saw public figures as role models, admired her strength, seeing it as something to emulate. But while much of the reaction was positive, there were some critics who argued that Melania had simply evaded difficult questions. These detractors believed that the former First Lady had avoided giving direct answers, particularly when it came to questions about her marriage. However, their voices were largely drowned out by the overwhelming praise Melania received for how she had conducted herself. In the days after the interview, even people who had never paid much attention to Melania Trump before began to see her in a new light. She had always been a somewhat reserved public figure, often overshadowed by the controversies surrounding her husband, Donald Trump. But this interview had given her a platform to show who she really was, and people were listening. As Melania walked off the stage, back to the dressing room, she felt a mixture of emotions. She had always known that being in the public eye came with intense scrutiny, but today's interview had pushed her further than most. The host's personal questions about her marriage had touched on topics that were deeply private, and while she had answered with grace, it wasn't easy. Her assistant greeted her with a warm smile as she entered the dressing room, offering her a bottle of water. "You handled that so well," the assistant said, admiration evident in her tone. "I can't believe how calm you stayed." Melania smiled but didn't say much. She didn't feel the need to discuss what had just happened on air. Her job was to represent herself and her values, not to engage in drama. But deep down, she was glad it was over. It wasn't that she couldn't handle the pressure. It was just that the constant questioning about her personal life was draining. As she sat down to gather her thoughts, her phone buzzed with messages from friends and family who had watched the interview. Many of them were offering words of encouragement, telling her how proud they were of how she had handled herself. Even Donald had sent her a text. "Great job. You were incredible as always." But what truly mattered to Melania wasn't the praise or the criticism. It was knowing that she had stayed true to herself, that she hadn't let the host drag her into a heated argument or force her into saying something she didn't want to say. She had maintained control, and that, to her, was the most important thing. As the hours passed and Melania left the studio, the weight of the interview began to lift from her shoulders. She had done what she needed to do. The rest, she knew, was out of her hands. She had no control over how the media would spin the story, no say in how people would interpret her words. But she was at peace with that. All she could control was her own actions, and today she felt she had done that perfectly. That night, as Melania sat in the quiet of her home, she reflected on everything that had happened. She knew the interview would be talked about for days, maybe even weeks. The headlines and the social media posts didn't concern her, though. What mattered most was the example she had set for herself, for her son, and for anyone watching who might be dealing with criticism in their own lives. Melania understood that she would always be a figure of public interest, that there would always be people who wanted to pry into her personal life or make assumptions about her marriage. But she had learned long ago that the only opinion that truly mattered was her own. She had faced scrutiny, judgment, and endless rumors, but through it all, she had maintained her sense of self. As she looked out at the stars twinkling in the night sky, Melania allowed herself a rare moment of pride. She wasn't someone who sought out the spotlight, but she knew she had a responsibility to use her platform wisely. And today, she had done just that. In her heart, she knew that many people, especially young women, were watching her, learning from how she handled herself in difficult situations. And if there was one lesson she hoped they took away from the interview, it was this. No matter how hard others try to tear you down, your strength comes from within. And that's something no one can take from you. As the world continued to react to the interview, Melania Trump remained as she always had been, composed, calm, and quietly confident. She knew that in the grand scheme of things, this interview was just another moment in a life filled with many. But in that moment, she had shown the world exactly who she was, and that, she realized, was enough.